Hey, welcome to the first painting lesson video. If this goes a little fast, just pause it. You can write down whatever information's on the screen and go at your own pace. If you have any further questions, feel free to send me a message or just comment below. Before we can begin painting, we have to go over some materials, as well as a few little tips and tricks. I'll have links to all of these materials in the description below. I think it makes sense that we start with canvases, and there are a lot of different types of canvases. This is a miniature canvas, and it's extremely light. The canvas is actually glued onto the sides, and it has gesso applied to the front and back of the canvas, which is pretty unique. Gesso is usually only applied to the top and sides of a canvas. An important note about these really small canvases is that the measurements are a little more prone to being off. Now, it's usually only by about 1 millimeter or 2, but when you're doing something like pixel art, sometimes that actually makes a difference. It's nothing that you can't work with, but it is something to be aware of. This is a more traditional staple bad canvas, something you would consider a tier 1 or beginner style canvas. There's nothing really special to it, staples all around the back, and the frame is the same kind of light pine or sometimes poplar, it depends. And the back of this canvas is not gessoed, however the front is. You'll find these a lot in multi-packs in art stores, something like Michael's, maybe Blick, or whatever kind of local art store you have near you. They tend to be less expensive, and you can throw a frame around it, but they get the job done. This is a more expensive canvas, even though the materials are pretty similar. This is what's considered a tier 3 or gallery wrapped canvas, and as you can see, it's quite a bit thicker than the other canvas. There is also no gesso on the backside of this. This is a very heavy frame, and it'll be pretty difficult to cause a whole lot of damage to it. The thickness really lends itself well to painting along the sides, if that's something you like to do. Even though this canvas is along the lines of my preference, this is not what we're using in our lessons. This is what we'll be using in the lessons. This is a canvas board. It's sturdy, very thin, and it has canvas stretched and glued to a cardboard surface. I like to use these for personal studies, and they come in a bunch of different sizes. Because they're inexpensive and pretty versatile, this is exactly what I want to use for these lessons. There will be links to these below. And then just further proof that this is actually what we'll be using through these lessons. And then there are paint brushes. Pretty important, right? These are the brushes that I'll be using through the next 2 paintings. This is the only one that isn't really a bargain brush. I just happen to like the size and the shape of it, so I grabbed it. You absolutely do not need expensive brushes. I'll give you a link to some good and fairly inexpensive brushes below. This is a really cheap brush, and it came in a very large multi-pack, but I take care of it, so I've had it for a long time. The angled bristles come in handy for many different things, and for these paintings, this is the brush I'll be using to fill in the backgrounds in larger areas. This is also an inexpensive brush that just came from a multi-pack. It has a flat, or some call it a chiseled edge. This is extremely useful for doing pixel art. It's absolutely not necessary. You can do pixel art with rounded brushes, but this does help. This is a smaller detail brush, some call it a liner. There are other names out there for it, but this really helps for those small details. You can correct lines that aren't straight. You can put tiny little pops of color in different places. We get a pretty good amount of use out of this little brush. This is just another flat-edged brush, but it's smaller in size. This helps with smaller details, and when we get to the second painting, it'll be pretty necessary. The pixels get pretty small on that second painting. Anything that we do with this brush can be done with the liner, but this makes it just a little bit easier, and then you can follow up cleaning up detail with the liner afterward. This is another brush that I really like to use for filling in color. Comes in handy and it's pretty smooth. It's not as bulky as the angled brush, but not as precise and small as the detail liner. It's just a nice round brush, and that's all you need. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. On the topic of brushes, we need to talk about cleaners. I recommend one of these 2 products or both. both. First is the studio soap, and you need to make sure that you have this mixed up really well, but this is the most natural form of brush cleaner. It does take a little more effort and time to clean, but if natural is your main concern, this is the way to go. And this is my favorite brush cleaner. It's low vapor, listed as non-hazardous, and whether you're just doing routine cleaning or you have a lot of dried on, neglected gunk on your brushes, this stuff will get it clean. And you don't have to worry about a bunch of toxic fumes or other concerns from heavy paint thinners. I really like this stuff. Oh, and then there's one of these little silicone doohickeys. You just stick it down to the bottom of a cup of soapy water and then move your brush around it, and it kind of knocks the paint out of the brush into the soapy water a little bit better than just moving the bristles against the cup. You don't want to put this in brush cleaner, just in like a little cup full of soapy water. Rags are kind of the silent hero of painting. You wipe and clean your brushes, your hands, any mistakes, spills, and they can come in many forms. This is just a stack of an old cut up curtain. You can also use old t-shirts, pants, undershirts, socks. I mean, you want to make sure they're clean. You'd be pretty amazed by how far a simple t-shirt goes. You can cut it up into smaller pieces or just roll and fold as you need it. And there's no harm in using the good old paper towel. You'll probably go through these a little faster, and it may create a little more waste, but it's always an option. And then you can always use what you got handy, like some old Chipotle napkins, because let's face it, these things aren't good for anything else. They are quite possibly the worst napkins in all of fast food. And yep, there are additives. We'll be using all of these at some point, but you don't really need to worry about most of them right now. For the first two paintings, we're only going to worry about this little bottle of water. That's all that's in here. We won't need to worry about the other additives until you start getting into the intermediate and more advanced paintings. But just kind of keep these in mind for right now. When we get to that point, I'll explain what the rest of this stuff is. Before we get into paint, which is the big one, let's talk about all the miscellaneous stuff. And this is just a plastic paint palette. It's really inexpensive, but it's all you need. Now, there are a lot of different types of paint palettes, and you can use whatever you want. And you can even use just a piece of aluminum foil if you wanted to. But what's nice about this is that it's kind of glossy, which makes it a little easier to clean, and it's got a bunch of different areas where you can mix paint and keep it separated. And it also has a lid, which is really important. It's not like oils where you can just walk away and your paint stay wet. With acrylics, you really want that lid to kind of seal everything off so your paint doesn't dry. I'll have a link to this below. Oh, and it's really important to keep this clean between paintings. It might not seem like that big of a deal, but you end up getting dried paint that pulls up into your wet paint over time, and then you'll have clumps that paint onto your canvas, and it'll just be a mess. And then there's the good old-fashioned ruler. You will need a ruler for this. We do measure out the pixels. Don't worry, I make it pretty easy, but it's always good to keep a ruler on hand anyway, and of different sizes, but if you just have one big ruler, that also works. I also usually keep like a little 6-inch ruler in my little to-go bag when I go do art out and about. Never underestimate the utility of a ruler. Another art staple is the pencil. If you're new to painting, you might not actually think about having a pencil. You see a lot of seasoned artists will just start throwing paint on a canvas, and it seems like they're coming up with all of this stuff from their imagination. Well, believe it or not, a good deal of artists start out with a drawing underneath their paintings. They would draw on the canvas just as they would draw on a piece of paper. This is the pencil that I prefer to use with pixel art. It is just a number 2 pencil, and it has the typical kind of eraser on the back, but it's a little bit different. You'll find that it's slightly flexible, but what makes this really nice is that the lead is less likely to rub off onto the palm of your hand as you're drawing across the canvas. Canvases are really rough, and they'll tear up your lead, causing you to get way more of that stuff on your hands than you would just a normal piece of paper. And if we look closer to the pencil on canvas, compared to a standard mechanical pencil, you can see on the right that there's quite a bit more residue buildup from the standard mechanical pencil. And that residue buildup is what gets onto your hands. And don't forget to have a pencil sharpener of some kind. When we're making the grid line for these pixels, it's incredibly important that your pencil remains sharp. That way your measurements are accurate and your canvas remains clean. So sharpen your pencil a lot. An important thing that isn't really stress to beginning artists is dexterity. Dexterity is important for not just building your skill as a painter, but also accomplishing the vision in your mind. And there are little exercises you should do before you paint to help you increase your dexterity. Your hands are one of your most important tools, and they need to be maintained and cared for just as a tool. You can push your palm flat into your desk and raise your fingers up, stretching them across. This will help you loosen up some of those muscles. You can also move your wrists around, try to get those as loose as possible. And as simple as it sounds, a helpful tool for loosening up your fingers is a stress ball of some kind. It can even be one of those little balls that you squeeze and eyeballs come out of it. I like using the Nido ball. I've got a link for it below, but I like it because it's extremely flexible, but the stuff inside, if a hole gets popped in this, it's not going to ruin my painting. But I use this to really work the muscles in the individual fingers. This helps me to move a little better, but I find that I also grip my paintbrush better. I'm a little less likely to drop it. I do also keep an old school water wiggler handy as well. Even though this will make quite a mess if he gets a hole popped in it, it's really useful. Kind of slips and slides around in your hand, and it gets your mind ready to pay attention to that hand-eye coordination. One of the most important elements of dexterity is something as simple as keeping your hands warm. Have you ever experienced mouse hand when you're working on the computer for a long time and the hand on your mouse gets extremely cold? The same thing can happen when you're painting. You need that blood flow, keeping your hands warm so you can have that dexterity. Cold hands perform poorly when painting, just as cold hands type poorly when you're sitting at the computer. There are different ways to quickly warm up your hands. I keep rice bags that I can just microwave and then wrap my hands in, but you can seriously just make yourself a warm cup of coffee or some hot tea and wrap your hands around the cup and get yourself nice and warm. The stretch break will also probably do you some good. Now here comes the big one, and that would be paint. From very basic and inexpensive to something a little more expensive and some fairly recognizable brands. And I actually filled this myself with a traditional wall paint. I've got a whole different video on that. You can go through my videos and watch that. What I want you to take away from this is that for these lessons, it doesn't matter what brand you get. You can get the inexpensive beginner acrylics, and that will be perfectly fine for this. There's no need to splurge on expensive paint, and unless you really want to. When you're starting out, brand and tier quality of paint really doesn't matter all that much. What we're really going to focus on is getting used to your paint, whatever paint you have, and learning how to use that to the best of your ability. When you go out to purchase your paints, one of the primary determining factors is viscosity. So I'm going to show you the differences in paint viscosity, what I prefer, and hopefully a little direction for what paint you want to choose, as well as modifying that viscosity if you already have paint on hand. This Craftsmart paint is technically somewhere between a soft and a fluid body paint. The Winsor Newton acrylic is pretty close to a soft body paint. And because I don't have any heavy body acrylics handy, I'm using the Winsor Newton oil color, which is fairly similar to a very heavy body acrylic. And then I have a golden fluid paint, and I actually prefer fluid paints. In fact, I'll probably thin this down a little bit more than it already is. The reason I prefer very fluid acrylics is because I feel it gives a very finalized and professional result. There's not a lot of lines or bumps anywhere in it. In fact, I was in an art show and one of the judges started to disqualify me because she thought that I had presented prints in the gallery. My husband had to run down the judge and explain to her that it was in fact a real painting. The final result was just very clean, without a bunch of lines and bumps in it. Now, a lot of people really love that texture in paint, but for this kind of project, I don't feel that it's very fitting, but that's totally up to personal preference. There is one reason that I do suggest more fluid paints for pixel art, and let's get into that. Heavy body paints are easy to identify because they can hold shape, and you can see a pretty sharp edge to that paint tip. On the opposite end of that, if you even just touch a fluid paint, it completely loses all shape. It's not quite the consistency of water. It does have a little more weight to it, but it's incredibly thin. And if we touch that Craftsmart paint that's somewhere between the soft and the fluid body, the shape also gives way pretty easily, but it's not quite as fluid. Both paints, even though pretty thin, cover very well. The idea that you have to have thick paint for full coverage is not correct. When you poke at the soft body paint, you can move it around and it still keeps a little bit of its shape. And with a heavy body paint, you pretty much have to scoop it in order to move it, and it will stay in the shape that you scooped it. However, I like to go even thinner than the fluid, so I'm just gonna add a little bit of water to it and mix it up. And even after thinning it out, you can see that it still has decent coverage. Unless I'm working in oils, I do tend to thin my paints out to a very fluid consistency. And when you magnify it, you can see the differences. Here, the paint is just rolling off the paintbrush, but it's not dripping, filling in all of the gaps on the canvas created by canvas texture, ignoring the one bristle that came loose, which is really distracting. But this is very easy to push around and manipulate, and it still offers full coverage. This has fairly similar results, but you can see that it has just a little more weight to it. You can see some of the ripples, and that's okay. It fills in the canvas texture nicely, and it has good coverage. While this is easy enough to push around, there is more texture to it. That remains a personal preference, but something to keep in mind is because it is thicker, it has to be purposefully pushed around the texture of the canvas. And you can see on the right side where the canvas is actually manipulating the paint around its texture. This is where the most notable difference starts. The thicker the paint becomes, the more difficult it becomes to unload it from the brush. Your brush strokes will not only be just a little less precise, but now you're pushing around waves of paint. And those waves of paint become even further impacted by the texture of the canvas. That's fine if this is your preference, but it is something to just be aware of. It does become more difficult to produce straight lines. This is not only because of the texture of the canvas, but it's also because you're more likely to leave a very small, potentially unnoticed bead of paint along your edges. So if you want to go back later to straighten out those edges, your dried acrylic will then have extra bumps that you have to work around, creating more difficulties trying to straighten that out. And then finally, this not only shows the lines and some of the difficulty with a heavy body paint, at least for the reasons that we're going to use it. And because the paint is so heavy, it actually skips across the texture of the canvas, leaving small portions of the canvas without any paint coverage. So you have to purposefully go back and fill in those spots. And to show our little demonstration in a more applicable sense, I created a fairly small grid of squares and then quickly filled them in with each paint in order of viscosity. If we look closer, here's where you can see those beads of paint that you might not be able to see from a normal distance. This is my primary reason for using fluid paints, especially with pixel art. This can really hinder your ability to go back and fix or adjust different areas of your painting. Your paintbrush will just bump right over those lines and you'll lose control of your paint. I hope this has helped you understand the importance and the impact of paint viscosity. And now you can understand what you're purchasing or what you already have. And that's it. That sets us up for our first painting. All of the materials in this video are listed below. Next week, we'll start our first introduction painting. If you've never picked up a paintbrush before, don't worry about it. It's not going to be that bad. And if you already paint a little bit, it might help you fine-tune some stuff. Either way, it'll be a fun painting, maybe a little bit challenging, something different to get used to, and you'll feel accomplished when you're done. For the remainder of this series, every Friday a new lesson will be uploaded. Feel free to subscribe to follow along, and you are always welcome to ask questions and add some comments or tips for me.